Thank you, choir. Very nice. We went from Jimi Hendrix covers last night to that beautiful anthem. How rich we are. So would you please pray with me? God of grace, God of hope, God who is the source of all that is good, lasting, and true, breathe your spirit of new life into us, we pray, with a spirit of anticipation for all the gifts. We say thank you. May God's people say, amen. So the Bible is a collection of stories of God choosing the most unlikely people to bring about that which is good. And that is particularly true with the story of Saul in this morning's passage. It was Saul who, when the disciple Stephen was stoned to death for being a religious heretic, it was Saul who held the coats of those who cast the stones. And it says in the 7th chapter of Acts that Saul approved what had happened. So now we pick up the story of Saul, who is a Pharisee. And a Pharisee is a religious lawyer. So imagine a lawyer as a literalist, as a fundamentalist, with narrow parameters as to what is allowable, and quick to cast judgment on anyone who is outside his narrow parameters of what is allowed. So Saul is hunting down those of the way, those early followers of Jesus. And most of the early followers of Jesus were Jewish in background. And so Saul felt that the followers of Jesus, believing that Jesus was the Messiah, the anointed one of God, that the people of Israel had long been waiting for, were religious heretics. So he went to the Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin, and he got permission to go into the synagogues in Damascus, about a week's journey, and he could enter the synagogues and find those who were followers of the way, those religious heretics, and then he would cast them into prison or even worse. And so there was Saul going to do this work. He was the enemy of the early Christians, a man to be feared. And rightly so. Do you ever put someone in a box? Ever put someone in the box and say, well, this one is the enemy. This one is the one to be feared. I went to an art installation of propaganda from World War I and World War II, and of how people on opposing sides, how they depicted the enemy, the other. And as you looked at these pieces of propaganda, you saw how they dehumanized the opponent. Because when you dehumanize your opponent, then it's much more easy to go to war. Saul had demonized his opponent. He had put them in a box, and those who feared Saul had put him in a box. Do you ever have an antagonist in your own life? You ever have someone that makes you uneasy? Maybe someone who has wronged you, and you think they are non-redeemable, that no good can come from this person. I remember I had a person when I lived in Oregon, where I lived for 20 years serving a church, and I had an antagonist who was part of my life for those 20 years. And I would try to set boundaries with this person, and this person didn't respect the boundaries. And I remember going to my spiritual director, who was my pastor, and sharing about my frustration with this antagonist in my life, who was not respecting me or respecting proper boundaries. And my spiritual director listened to me for the upteenth time, complaining about this individual. And he said, well, this person is a gift. And I looked at him like he had two heads. How could this person who was abusing the boundaries, how could this person be a gift to me? And my spiritual director listened to me, saw how I was upset with him for saying that, And he said, how else can you learn about forgiveness? How else can you experience the potential for reconciliation? This person is a gift. That's hard to believe, isn't it? Think of the antagonists in your life, the people who rub you the wrong way. How can that person be a gift? Ever place yourself in a box? We may place others in a box. Maybe you ever categorize yourself in a certain way? You ever think, I'm as good as I'm going to get? Or have you ever argued for your own limitations? Said, this is as much as I can accomplish in life? The writer Richard Bach says, argue for your limitations long enough, and sure enough, they're yours. So you ever put yourself in a box and say, this is as good as it's going to get? To steal a line from a movie. You ever think your life is as good as it's going to get? So Saul is in a box. He has placed the Christians in a box. They have placed him in a box. And we pick up the story in chapter 9, verse 3. Now, as he was going along and approached Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. And he fell to the ground, and he heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And he asked, who are you, Lord? And the reply came, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. For Saul, the conversion, the turning is dramatic. Whereas for some of us, our evolution as human beings, at least it is for me, is gradual, sometimes incremental. But change for Saul in this passage is dramatic. He is spoken to by Jesus, whom he is hunting down his people, and everything changes in seemingly a blink of the eye. Verse 8, Saul got up from the ground where he had been knocked down, and though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. And for 3 days he was without sight, and neither ate nor drink. So here is Saul going through a conversion experience after being spoken to by Jesus, and now he is vulnerable, and now he cannot see, and he is led like a child into the city of Damascus. And then we're told for 3 days and 3 nights, he does not eat and he does not drink. Echoing Jesus in the tomb, or Jonah in the belly of the whale. Anyone who heard these numbers, the number 3, knew that there was transformation that was taking place for the character in the story. And that is certainly true for Saul. And then we hear this in verse 10. Now there was a disciple in Damascus, a disciple of Jesus named Ananias. The Lord said to him in a vision, Ananias, and he answered, here I am. And the Lord said to him, get up on the street called Straight, and go to a man from Tarsus named Saul. And at that moment you will place your hands upon his eyes, and he will be healed. Ananias is a Greek name which means he who brings grace. And Saul, we are told, was transformed completely and went into the synagogues, those who he was formerly hunting, and preached the good news of God coming into the world in the story of Jesus. Imagine Saul with all his imperfections. Saul who was feared, rightly feared, by followers of the way, followers of Jesus, now was embraced and one of them. It's amazing how God chooses unlikely ones like Saul to bring about that which is in keeping with God's plans. The prophet, poet, and musician Leonard Cohen writes this. He talks about us being imperfect, yet he says our imperfection can become the doorway to something more. Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Do we believe this to be true? There is a crack in everything. There is a crack in everyone. It's what it means for us to be human. And that is how the light gets in. Richard Rohr is a Franciscan monk, and he wrote a book called Falling Upward. And it talks about the two halves of life. In the first half of life, we are shaping our identity. We're thinking about what we are good at. We're thinking about who we belong to. We're thinking about who will go with us through life. And that's an essential part of life. But Rohr says in the second half of life, we've been humbled. We have fallen on our nose. We have made mistakes. Anyone here fall on their nose? Anyone here besides me, take some detours in life? Anyone here besides me, if they had a chance to do a do-over, they would do it? It's what it means to be human. We have people that break trust with us. There are people that we have broken trust with. There are errors we've made. There are circumstances beyond our control that humble us. And Rohr says because of those circumstances, we have an opportunity to deal with questions that we otherwise wouldn't deal with in the first half of life. Such as, what do we really believe? Not who do others tell us what to believe, but what do we truly believe about God, about our values and our morals? What is essential for us when everything else has been stripped away? Rohr says it's in those wounded moments, those broken moments, those times when there are cracks in our lives, in our psyche, and in our hearts. It's then that the light of hope and healing, paradoxically, can begin to break forth. And this isn't to say that God causes the pain or the brokenness in our lives, but that God can use those broken times to bring about that which is life-giving. Do we believe that to be true? Perhaps that's what's going on with Saul. Perhaps he was not indifferent when he held the coat as Stephen's life was taken by the religious fundamentalists. Perhaps he began to struggle with his own conscience. And perhaps it was more than just a dramatic conversion at the gates to Damascus. Perhaps God had been working about some new ways of thinking and some new ways of being. How does God work in your life? My guess is we are all across the spectrum here this morning related to our spiritual journey. Some of us are seekers. Some of us are believers. I know that I grew up in the church, been in the church my whole life, but my understanding of the nature of God has continued to evolve to this very day. We are all in a process of becoming more if we allow God's Spirit to be at work. Which brings us back to the season of Lent. We are invited to name and acknowledge our own wounds and our own struggles, to be open to the possibility that God is breaking into our lives and offering us some new ways of being, some new ways of becoming more whole and more complete. The word salvation means to become more whole, more complete, the person that God has created you and me to be. I have a friend who said that they are in the process of being repaired. My friend said that they are in the process of being repaired. How about you? Where do you need to be repaired this Lenten season? What wounds or brokenness do you and I carry that God's light and God's love can bring about an element of repair? Lent is a season of reflection, each in our own way to speak to God and speak to God of our longings, our hopes, our dreams, our brokenness, our wounds, our regrets, and to allow that light to begin to break forth. We'll close with these words from Leonard Cohen. Ring the bell that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. There is a crack in everyone. That's how the light gets in. This is the good news, thanks be to God, as we begin this Lenten journey together. And may God's people say, amen.